Welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your 4 pixels on my face host, Madelyn.
I'm your beep-beep-boop-boop host, Emma.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's show. It's Side Quest Edition. It's my turn. My turn always comes around again so quickly. I feel like it was just my turn 6 weeks ago. And this week, we are going to be talking about retro styles, retro aesthetics in gaming. Not about retro games, although some about retro games, no doubt. But games that have been made more recently that take advantage of these quote-unquote retro styles. So, why are they so popular? What kinds of games are we choosing to replicate? When will this looks like a PS3 game become something exciting and complimentary?
I don't know. This game looks very yellow. My nostalgia.
Look, I'm sure that, people were... not even that long ago, people were like, why would you want to make a PS1 looking game? And now those are becoming popular.
People don't know, when people say like, oh, it looks like a PS2 cutscene, they don't know what that means.
I know.
I barely know what that means, but they definitely don't know what that means.
It means you can't skip it. That's pretty much all I know.
What they mean is it looks bad, but like, it doesn't, usually what they're talking about never actually looks bad in the way that older games looked, quote unquote, bad, so...
And this is something that's tricky, that's at the heart of all of our conversation today, I think, which is that there's not really a consensus on what retro is. Like, where is the line for retro? And also, even if there was a line, people don't remember what stuff actually looked like.
Yeah.
So, to talk about something having a retro style, or faithfully replicating a retro style, is itself sort of always filtered through the what do you actually remember of this, and what did it actually look like?
Yeah, when you start playing around in, like, more recent, I say recent, like PS2 era looks, you run the risk of people not being like, oh, it looks like, this old aesthetic, and more like, why are these graphics so behind the times,
But it'll be interesting to me to see how far can that boundary push. Right, so typically when you think of a game with retro styles, you're probably thinking of something like 8-bit, 16-bit kind of version, right, where it's pixel art, right? And because like 99 times out of 100, if we're talking about a game that has a retro look, it's like it's a pixel art game.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration. 9 times out of 10?
Maybe. I don't know.
More than half of the time.
I don't like throwing numbers out there unless I actually, whatever.
Okay, fair enough.
You can say most.
It feels like the games that get the most attention in the retro space, the games that have been the most successful in the, like, I'm imitating an older style kind of world, I think pixel art is certainly the one that gets the most attention. How about that? You're right. Sure. I won't throw out there statistics out there that I can't back up. But in terms of kind of what comes up when you search for retro games, it's going to be pixel art first. But it's interesting to me to think like, okay, so like now there's starting to be some pushing the boundary of that PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64 aesthetic, like has become retro and has become desirably retro for certain things. But in my mind, it's like, like you said, it sort of feels like the PlayStation 2 is never going to be able to break through to be a positive retro thing.
Well, I actually think that a lot of what makes something feel retro versus just
bad,
not good,
is
the intentionality behind it more than like anything else. Like I can look at, a Cold Steel and I can be like, these graphics are a little bit behind. And I don't look at that and be like, oh, they're doing this on purpose to create like a PS2 type look. No, like just what it looks like, right?
Yeah.
Versus you look at something like Signalis, which is like PS1 looking horror, and you're like, oh, they did this super on purpose, right? Because it's not like even with pixel graphics, like modern pixel graphics, like they are more advanced and detailed than a lot of pixel graphics from older times, right? Because there's the technology for that. So you see people applying modern technology to retro-looking games, and that's what makes them look retro versus bad, which is funny to think about to me.
But see, I think what I'm getting at here is that, you know, up through these eras so far, there's really notable hardware limitations. And not to say that the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3 didn't have notable hardware limitations, but it starts to feel like those are caused less distinctive workarounds, perhaps, with each passing generation. And so even if the idea is eventually there will be people who are making quote-unquote PS2 style games, you do wonder how much of that is going to express itself in terms of a specific look to the game, so much as trying to capture something about, you know, what that genre of game in that era was like.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, PS2 games are probably the place where I don't have a very good conception of what that looks like as a whole.
Yeah.
Because, like, I feel like I just think of Kingdom Hearts, and that is not, I don't think, representative of what most games looked like on the PS2. But also, I don't know that, really. I think of the PS3 as being very brown.
I can't wait in 10 years when everybody is making their brown tinted games.
I do think the brown, like yellow-brown sort of filter is something that just like is like a cycle thing, like fashion, you know?
Right.
Unfortunately.
So do you think we're due for a brown era? Again.
Maybe next generation will be a brown era. Yeah.
So we've sampled a lot of the things that we're gonna talk about here today, but something that I think is at the heart of sort of all of this retro stuff, and you can't talk about these retro aesthetic games without talking about is nostalgia, right? That's something that, apart from anything else, feels key to a lot of these games and the decision to style them in this particular way. Which I think is especially interesting given that the sort of rasterized pixel art thing is a throwback to the 80s and 90s. And aren't the majority, not, this is just me, this whole episode just me being like, fake statistics for you. Here we go. But I would assume that the we are approaching the majority of gamers having not really gamed during the 80s and 90s.
Sure. I think that what's most important here is when the developers grew up,
Right.
not when the gamers grew up, if that makes sense.
You're telling me the capital G gamers aren't the most important thing here?
Of course they are. They always are. But no, like, the people making pixel art games is because they like those when they were young, and they're doing it for modern times. And I think a lot of times people buy it just because the pixel art looks cool. Less than any nostalgia.
That's fair. Which is so interesting because, of course, pixel art's the style was like deliberately sort of squashed.
Also, I think that perhaps you are pushing pixel art too far back. I mean, we had the GBA, right?
That's true.
That was still pretty pixel arty for a lot of those games.
That's true. I can't argue with that. I feel like it's some of these games definitely have aesthetics that harken back further than that. But you're right that I'm probably not giving enough credit to the handhelds that kind of continued that onward, even past the time when consoles were doing that. That makes sense.
I mean, handhelds are dead now, so
Right.
maybe in another 20 years, people will be like, pixel art. Or maybe they'll just be like, oh yeah, those indies I played when I was a child.
Well, that's what it's
Harken
gonna
back.
be. It's gonna become this weird. I can't wait for that, to be honest. I think it'll be weird.
But
weird AF.
the heyday of handhelds was not that long ago. So
You're right. I can't wait though for the like retro revolution again in like 10 years, because you're totally right. People will be like, yeah, I loved Celeste, I loved Stardew Valley. And it's like, oh man, like how many times,
even Minecraft,
right?
Exactly.
I loved Minecraft. You're right. I guess Minecraft alone will prevent the nostalgia for pixel art from ever really going away.
Yeah.
But still, I'll be fascinated to see what does it look like when developers aren't imitating, Super Mario or whatever. They're imitating their childhood with Minecraft. Like, how many times can it go through the copier and still look like it does,
Yeah. I mean, pixel art will always be cool, so there's that too.
Do you think it's fair that the pixel art gets shoved into the retro box? I feel like so many of these developers in these interviews were like, pixel art is just cool. Stop telling me it comes down retro.
It comes down to intentionality again, right? Not everything pixel art has to be harkening back to your nostalgia. I think Papers, Please was one example that I saw that I thought was really good of like, yeah, that's pretty pixel art, but it's not, that is pixel art, but it's not nostalgic.
Yeah.
Right? I don't look at Papers, Please and be like, oh yes, Zelda. So it does, again, comes, like, because there are definitely some games that are meant to feel like older games, right? But then there's just some games that use it because that's what they want to use or what they're experienced in or what they think fits the game.
Definitely. Yeah, I feel like there's sort of two, I mean, like you're saying here, there's kind of two branches to this. There's the retro aesthetics that are taking advantage of it because they're drawing on nostalgia and they're wanting that to harken back to that. And then there was also a running theme through a lot of the reading that I did in preparation for this about, and it sort of surprised me because I hadn't really thought about it in this way very much. And it was interesting to see this applied both to developers talking about making kind of low poly PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64 style games, and also developers making like rasterized pixel styled games, is the idea of games these days, shakes fistic cloud, don't leave enough room for your imagination. That there's no place for you to fill in the blanks, and these sort of older styles allow you to like participate as an imaginer more.
And that makes sense to me.
It does, but it's all, I don't know, it's just like it totally makes sense. It was just a surprising take for me, as someone who hadn't really thought about, I don't know, I guess I had thought about it a little bit in the context of the kind of low poly ones, especially since so many of those games seem to be leaning into the horror, kind of PS1 horror genre, Silent Hill sort of idea. But I hadn't really thought about it in the same way for pixel art, the idea that it's like allowing you to fill in the blanks.
Mm-hmm.
But it does make a lot of sense. That said, as you have pointed out to me many times, just because they look retro doesn't mean that they are actually anything like the games of old.
Yeah.
Both in terms of the ways that they are actually built and the many modern conveniences that players expect these days.
Yeah. And that's not a bad thing.
No, of course. I mean, I think that the like big overarching thing about this topic in this episode is not to say like, if your game is styled like a game from this era, it must be like that. That's the only reason you could want to do that. Yeah. It must follow those rules. No, of course not.
I mean, evoking nostalgia is mostly about showing it the way that people remember it, not how it necessarily actually was, right?
Yeah.
So in the ways that things are presented, in the ways things look, in the ways things feel, it's like the way that they remember it being. And not that those older games weren't like great, right? I just think like we've learned a lot of lessons about UI over the years. You know? Stuff like that.
Well, those games themselves were mostly harkening back to, I mean, in some cases not literally harkening back, sometimes harkening sideways to their arcade game counterparts, right? And so because of that, they carry things over, including like a lack of UI or a brutal death system that is based on you wanting to throw away all your quarters, right? That aren't necessarily what people remember about the experience of the game, even if it was part of it. We're soft now. We've gotten used to our soft games, our soft gamer hands, our baby gamer hands.
Yes. Yeah, we're just baby gamers.
Back in the good old days, we had hard adult gamer hands.
Yeah.
We didn't even need a UI.
Yeah. Whenever there's a remaster that like doesn't give me like a map, I'm like, why did you do this?
I mean, you know, part of the like old school aesthetic I do feel like is difficulty. It's weird to think about that, right? That so many of these games, not only is it like, the style looks like this, but it's also saying, remember when games were actually hard?
Yeah.
Now, not giving a map sucks. That's bad. That's a bad idea. That's hard in a not fun way.
I mean, it of course depends on the game, but when I'm playing like, you know, like a classic, like JRPG, big world exploration thing, and like, or like I can't like look up what my objective was.
Well, back in the day,
put it down for 4 days and I'm just screwed.
Should probably go buy the strategy guide, Emma.
You're right. I should have bought the strategy guide.
Feels like that's due for, I mean, alongside this, like, feels like strategy guides are due for a comeback, like printed strategy guides.
I feel like there's been a couple of, like, collector's editions that have put in, like, a game guide.
I just feel like if these haunted PlayStation 1 demo disc people really want to get the real aesthetic, they should make sure that they get guides available for purchase.
Yeah, that's true.
Probably worth the effort and worth the money. Absolutely. No question.
I think one of the best sort of... Well, for a lot of points, I think that looking at the HD 2D, as they've branded it, games that Square Enix has been putting out, like Octopath Traveler and the Live Live, etc., is a really good example of like both like how you can market to nostalgia while also very clearly being modern.
Yeah.
And also how sometimes that choice is not necessarily like a resources measure. And I think Octopath Traveler took about as much like effort as a lot of like the realistic looking titles that they put out.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's important to remember, right, that like, I mean, obviously AAA budgets for games have changed dramatically since 2D games were the way to go. But, you know, at the time, right, that was the AAA style, right? That's what they looked like. They were big budget games. And what that means has changed. But of course, there's plenty to be said for, in comparison, a 2D game can potentially cost less than a 3D game. Right? Or can potentially require fewer resources or expertise in a different way than a 3D game. And it's, I don't want to say it's easier. What do I want to say? Like, if your goal is to create an entirely photorealistic game, there is a basement to your budget that can be, right? There is a threshold that it has to meet. It is,
you do, like, you can't just say, like, the graphics determine your budget, though.
Of course not.
Of course. You have to be thinking about what game is being made, also.
Of course, exactly. So I think what I'm trying to set up is, although there is perhaps a perception that a 2D game is going to be less expensive and quote-unquote easier to make than a 3D game, and while if you are comparing games of a certain scope and of a certain type 1-to-1 against each other, that may be true. It's certainly not the case that choosing to make something retro suddenly makes it as easy as it would have been to make that game in the year 1995.
can no longer just toss your code in the trash as soon as it's done. Just move that whole game to the recycle bin.
You can't do it.
Can't do it anymore.
But also, even if you did, even if you could, even if hypothetically it was like, yes, I can make a game exactly as I would have made it in 1995, and like magically that game can be played on a PlayStation 5, right? Nobody would like it. It would not look like what they remember games in 1995 to look like, because our brains have changed how we look at games.
Somebody out there would like it.
Okay, you're right. I'm sorry.
Some nerd out there would be freaking out.
Of course, you're right. Like there's a place for preserving gaming history.
I'm just kidding. I agree. Like, I think that, you know, there's like a big popular perception of what each sort of era looks like, and it's not necessarily fully reflective of what that was. But there are definitely some huge nerds out there also. Complimentary.
You're totally right. It's not to say there's not an audience for complimentary nerds. There's like, of course there is. And that's what, you know, sign up for Nintendo Switch Online, right? Haha. Look, maybe it'll help like the Game Boy particular style come back.
Yeah, I want to know how many people have Nintendo Switch Online plus expansion pack.
If they had launched that while people were still playing Animal Crossing, I would have gotten it. If they'd launched it like a year earlier, you know, I would have gotten it.
Yeah.
Because it would have been worth it, right? You've been like, oh, I'm going to pay for this anyway.
I guess so.
I don't know. I throw a bunch of money at Sony every month for their BS stuff too. Like, it's all BS. All of it's BS. Anyway,
yeah.
Sidebar there. The important thing being, I really feel like, I mean, just as a good golden rule, everything looked crappier than you remember it looking. Of all things in your life.
All things, yeah.
Everything was worse than you remember.
Not necessarily bad, but worse.
But worse. So that's why I feel like if you just like made a mid-90s game, an 80s game, and was like, here it is, isn't this what you've been wanting? Everybody loves this. They'd be like, where's the UI? The lighting looks weird. looks blurry.
What is interesting though is you can point to Silent Hill 2, I think, is probably like the pinnacle example of this. Of like every remaster Konami has put out has ruined it in some way. So like play like an authentic version of Silent Hill 2, you have to like get it, like their remaster, and then install like a whole bunch of fan fixes that like puts the fog back and redoes the original voice acting. Like a lot of what people love about Silent Hill 2 is that it's kind of weird and sort of sounds bad. like all these sort of quirks about it that were either caused by the hardware, or perhaps particularly unintentionally done by the developers. And I think that's why you see like for the remake project that's happening now, why you see a ton of people being like, I don't want it. I just want a functional version of the original, Konami. Because it feels like a lot of what made it special to people was not necessarily what the developers had in mind when developing it. And so by remaking it, it's bringing it more to like a modern view take of what they wanted. But it's now not what made that game iconic in the first place.
Absolutely.
So it is interesting. There is like, you can go back to older games and people love it because of all of those flaws, quote unquote, right? And by fixing it, you're actually making it less, like, characterful, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, so much of this, like, all of the things that are distinctive about the visuals from, you know, PS1 and before, come from the limitations of the era, right? There's only so much you could do graphically there. The thing has to be a certain aspect ratio, right? Like you're working with a different kind of TV than we are now. You're working with like, yeah, we have to hide everything in fog because our draw distance freaking sucks. So it's interesting, and you know, I love thinking about this in art in all mediums, right? The idea of these limitations being the thing that becomes distinctive, even if at the time I'm sure people were just like, yeah, this sucks. I'm sure the Silent Hill people were like, this sucks that we have to throw fog everywhere. This is not what we want. This sucks. And they happened to stumble on something that worked, but of course it's hard to know that when you're on the inside.
Yeah. And yeah, like you get like just trying to make something that, you know, people are very picky about their CRTV-ness, right?
Yep.
Of when things were made, like it did impact how things were made, because CRTVs, you wouldn't have to make the image necessarily as sharp as you would now. So when you get remasters who have to make everything bigger and sharper all of a sudden, and they do their AI upscales and everybody hates it. But at a certain point, it's like, well, I guess it's that, or you're just redrawing it, because you can't just make an image bigger.
Which, by the way, I have to say, I'm a stupid little gamer. I didn't really even think of that. I didn't really even think of the fact that it's like, oh, TVs are bigger now, so your pixels are gonna look stupid because they're like 10 times the size. That's not something that had even occurred to me before I thought about this. I was like, yes, of course, just scale it up. But no, of course not. That's not how it works.
Well, you just, you know, you take like, put like a tiny image on your image editing thing and just like drag it up and see what happens to it, right? That's the issue with remastering it for modern times.
Right.
Because the image files aren't necessarily like the ones you've saved. Maybe they were bigger, the originals, if you kept the originals. But the ones that were on the game are probably very small. And same thing with audio tracks, too. Is you get that issue. You probably made those audio tracks very compressed, and you can't just uncompress audio very easily.
What do you mean?
You're right, you just hit Control-Z.
Yeah.
On the game.
Just, like, stretch it out. That's something we haven't talked about too much yet at this point, that, you know, of course, retro doesn't just cover the look of the game, it also covers the sound of the game.
Yeah.
Although that feels pretty exclusive to chiptunes at this point in time, to me. I can't say that I can think of anything else that harkens back too much to any... You know, I take that back. The only thing I could say that would harken back to that is, like... maybe things like the Tony Hawk remakes or something like that, where they managed to track down that licensed music that seemed impossible for decades. But that weirdly in itself is another sort of like bizarro limitation of the gaming industry leading to something delightful, right? It's like, I'm sure like nobody thought that including the Backstreet Boys on a soundtrack or whatever would cause a problem 20 years down the line, but there it is.
Yeah, I think things can be nostalgic like that, but that they're more game specific, whereas like in terms of like retroness as a whole, it is like chiptunes feel nostalgic, right?
I guess I'm just saying that this is the one thing that jumps out to me currently right now from something like the PS2 era of gaming that could be successfully implemented in a nostalgic way, which would be the return of licensed music to games.
There's tons of games with licensed music. What are you talking about?
I know, but like the return...
It's a huge... People don't want that anymore because we have Twitch.
I know they don't. I'm saying eventually Twitch will fall.
The music one day. Twitch.
I just mean like the kind of like, when do I get to have my Burnout Radio soundtrack again?
Yeah.
But I don't think we're there. I mean, we're not there yet because Twitch and YouTube...
I mean, our consoles also now have the ability that you can just play your Spotify while you're playing the game.
That's unhinged behavior. That's total separate hot take here, but the idea that you would just play your Spotify... Like, whatever. If you're playing, like, Apex or Fortnite or something, like, whatever.
I think that's what it's for, yeah.
But just the idea that in, like, a game that isn't something like that you'd be like, no. Like, let's listen to Justin Bieber right now. Like, that's...
Sometimes that is the correct, sometimes you're playing a game and you're like, this scene would be enhanced if it was Justin Bieber playing right now.
But see, that's what I'm asking for. I'm asking for more Final Fantasy Stranger of Paradise Frank Sinatra moments. Like
Final
that.
Fantasy does always have at least one, like, theme song. Right?
Yeah,
Final Fantasy 15 had the Stand By Me.
Because it's a game series from, like, the 80s. That's why.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Sure.
Anyway, putting that aside, that was just me bracketing off, like, oh, okay, that's one thing from that era of gaming that I could actually see becoming retro one day. But you're totally right, and I totally agree that right now retro sound is basically 100% synonymous with the chiptune style.
Yes.
Which is not to say, again, that those chiptunes sound like chiptunes.
Whatever that means.
I mean, the chiptune soundtracks that you get in a fun indie in 2023 are much more well done.
Well, they're much more complicated.
That's what
right?
I mean to say. I don't mean they're better.
They can be, because there is no longer, like, the hardware limitations of, like, why they did chiptunes versus, like, orchestrated stuff. You can have things that are chiptunes but have, like, more going on or are bigger in file size or whatever, so they can be, like, more complex and probably higher sound quality. Maybe you could mix in the other stuff with the chiptunes too, so you can really make it like an aesthetic choice versus just what I do. As someone who played the Game Boy and Nintendo DS, I do have some nostalgia for chiptunes, I think.
Me too.
Ace Attorney. Gotta get those beep boops when you're closing in on the suspect.
Do you feel like... I did see a few notes in some of the things I read of the idea that because the chiptunes had to be simpler, they're a little bit more iconic for that reason. Do you think that that's real, or do you think that that's just they've used the same Zelda soundtrack since the very beginning, and so of course it's iconic because we've all listened to it?
Well, like, it's all melody, right?
Yeah.
It's, like, straight to the point, this is what the melody is, versus having a bunch of, like, orchestral, instrumental stuff happening around the melody.
Mm-hmm.
Which, of course, that can be very epic, too, but it's perhaps not quite as, like, brain-entering-y.
Earwormy, I think is what you're looking for.
Like, as immediately earwormy as a chiptune can be.
As a side note, I was doing some work at a coffee shop this week, and they were playing... I should have known, because the barista was wearing the Luigi beanie that you have. And they were playing exclusively, like, lo-fi video game beats to study from. So I
Good for them.
heard, like, so many remixes on the Zelda theme. Just over and over. It was bopping, don't get me wrong. But Click Click Boyfriend and I kept looking at each other like, oh, another one. That was not what inspired this episode, by the way, but it was part of it. It's part of it. Thinking about it.
Part of it, yeah. Yeah.
They burrowed into my brain. I couldn't get away. It's also interesting to me that these styles have also in some ways become pretty synonymous with certain types of games, right? Like, I think of a Pixel is a little broader than the PS1 right now, but I feel like the Pixel games are often either kind of a Zelda-like, right? Something like, is it Eastward or Eastbound? Eastbound, right?
Eastward.
Great. Settled on the wrong one. So something like Eastward, right? Like Stardew Valley isn't as Zelda-like, but like the idea of like the monster part of Stardew Valley.
Sure.
So they're either kind of like Zelda-y games, or they're like platformer, like harkening back
There's
to
definitely
Mario.
a subgroup of like turn-based.
Oh, that's true.
RPGs.
I didn't turn-based. I'll throw in there. That's totally right. Yes, also that. But like, you're not seeing.
Chained Echoes that I'm playing right now is very clearly like classic turn-based RPG inspired.
That is fair. But you're not seeing, I don't know, it's like, it's interesting. It's like, oh, we're not seeing like a lot of pixel art shooters, right?
Well, we talked about Hotline Miami.
You're right. I'm not saying they aren't there. I'm just saying it's interesting to me that these styles often also go along with a certain type of game. And a certain type of game that is like served by that style, right? You're right. Hotline Miami exists. There's no shooters, but it's like we're not seeing a ton of pixel FPS games. We're not seeing a ton of people go like, I'm gonna make a full pixel like open world. Like I'm gonna make Breath of the Wild, but in like pixel style.
Minecraft.
Oh, you're right. I don't even think of Minecraft is like somewhere in between like pixel and PS1 to me.
Well, it's 3D, so I see why you're not putting it necessarily in the same group.
Minecraft is just its own thing.
I'm just saying, Nintendo stole so blatantly from Minecraft for their Breath of the Wild game.
You're right. They should really make a Minecraft trailer that like is, the Breath of the Wild vista.
Yeah.
But then the PlayStation 1 seems to be really almost exclusively applied right now to horror games.
Yeah.
Which makes
or at
total
least
sense.
Like there's like the Bloodborne remake that's like really popular.
Yeah.
But that's like horror adjacent, I would say.
Plus, the Bloodborne remake is really much more about nostalgia than it is necessarily about it being like that style necessarily 100% serves that game. I just felt it was interesting that, well, I would be interested to see more of these things like, okay, how do they apply to something that is like very outside the genre of what we typically associate them with, right? What happens when you take that really uncanny PS1 style and it's like a dating sim instead, or or I don't know, you know what I mean? Or if it's the blocky like sports guys, like I'm interested as we continue, these become more and more and more retro, to see further spins on stuff, because it does sometimes feel like things, it's like, oh, it's pixel, so it's gonna be a platformer, like that kind of assumption. And obviously that's not the case. There's a lot of funky stuff out there, but I want more funky stuff.
There's always funky stuff out there, Madeline.
You're right.
You know where to look for it.
I don't know where to look for it. That's the problem.
Just have to keep your eyes open.
Emma, you raised an important point that in the notes that I'd like you to dig into a little bit, if you're willing.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Why is it that when people say it looks like X as an insult, it's always PlayStation?
Oh, yeah. I did notice that. Like, we were talking about it earlier on the podcast of, like, people saying, like, oh, like, this looks like a PS2 game. I saw people saying that about, like, Forspoken, and I was like, no, it doesn't. It's stupid.
Just another example. People don't remember what the PlayStation 2 looked like.
You could dislike how it looks, and it doesn't look like a PS2 game. And, like, that's always, but it's always PlayStation. It's always like, this looks like a PS2 game, this looks like a PS3 game. I see it about like movie CGI sometimes too. Like, this looks like a PS3 game.
Because it's brown?
I guess. I don't know. And I wondered why it was always PlayStation and not like whatever equivalent like Xbox, Nintendo console happened to be in that generation.
Well,
it might just be because it's shorter, like you said. People are lazy, and it is Twitter. Although Twitter doesn't have limit anymore, does it?
If you pay for it.
Oh, right. If you pay for it, now you can write a whole blog post.
If you pay for it, you too can have the privilege of saying, this looks like an Xbox Series X game. That's current, I know, but you get the idea.
This looks like a current generation game.
I'd like to see that leveled at a retro-looking game. Like, what are they doing here? This looks like the Series X. Do you think that's why Xbox gives their consoles such long titles, so that they don't become the pejorative, this looks like something from 3 generations ago?
No, I don't think that's why, personally.
Agree to disagree, I guess.
I mean, they don't actually give Series X is sort of the exception, I guess, but they don't actually give theirs very long titles. It's just that Xbox is longer than the PS abbreviation that you can do.
Right.
You can't really abbreviate Xbox.
And 360 takes 3 syllables.
You're right.
So PS3, much catchier than Xbox 360.
I guess so.
That's my theory. I mean, it's also, I can never remember. It was the PS3, the generation that the PlayStation was like totally dominant. It wasn't, right? It was PS4.
No. I think the PS3 did badly.
That's
right?
what I
the
thought.
Xbox 360 was definitely bigger than the PlayStation 3.
So maybe it's like
because the PS3 was like weird. Like it doesn't work like the other versions of the PlayStation in some way.
And so it's like now it's more of a loser. And if
I
you
guess
say
so.
you can't really do like PS2 and Xbox, right? Because if you say that looks like an Xbox game, it's not really
That's too vague.
Yeah, it's not clear what you're talking about. You just seem like
Yeah.
a console wars person.
And I guess everybody always thinks that Nintendo games have always looked beautiful and flawless.
Well, I just
Like
think
gamers.
I think invoking Nintendo makes it sound like at any point you're like, this game looks like it's Mario. You know, like Nintendo is too synonymous with certain brands where if you compare it, people would be like, I don't know, this doesn't really remind me of Pikachu at all, dude.
Yeah.
Like, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's fair.
I feel like I've really gotten a deeper understanding of the psychology of gamers by having...
Honestly, me too. I do feel like I understand why they use PlayStation now. Makes sense.
Listeners, if you're out there and you're the kind of person who's like, this looks like a PS2 game, if you would reach out to us and let us know if we've captured your psyche here, we would appreciate it.
Yeah.
You mentioned this in here a little bit, but do you feel like there's a nostalgic game style for you that has not yet been tapped or taken advantage of, or that has? Are you drawn to certain retro looks?
I was trying to think about it. I feel like I just didn't play like a super wide variety of games as a child. Like I played games, but also I feel like as a kid I really played the same game like over and over again in a way that I don't do now.
Yeah.
I was thinking about it a little bit, like, in terms of, like, games that I've played, like, older titles and have played newer titles. I am sort of nostalgic for when, for, like, the Fire Emblem, they would set, like, the 2 character arts next to each other on, like, a background, and they would talk like that, versus having, like, the 3D models there. I'm nostalgic for the pretty artwork that isn't just, like, that isn't, like, a visual novel, I guess.
Emma wants art. Emma harkens back to the era of art.
Pretty character art.
Yeah, I also feel like I don't necessarily have an attachment to a specific visual style. Again, just because... I may be remembering this very wrong, but I don't think of the PlayStation 2 as having, like, a particularly specific visual look.
I remember playing Kingdom Hearts on the PlayStation 2. What other games did we play on the PlayStation 2? Spyro.
We definitely played Spyro. Although that may have been PlayStation 1. I don't know. It's all a little bit of a blur.
Crash Team Racing.
Crash Team Racing. That PlayStation 1? Crash Bash.
Were those PlayStation 1 games, though?
Those were definitely PlayStation 1 games, yes.
I mean, we probably played the PlayStation 2 could play PlayStation 1 games.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So we probably played them on the PlayStation 2, but they're not PlayStation 2 games.
On both the PlayStation 1 and the PlayStation 2, I think, but yes.
I guess I'm nostalgic for the X-Men Legends.
Yeah.
Little blocky guys.
We'll never get that again, though, because I'm nostalgic for an era of Marvel before.
Yeah, yes, that's true. The before times.
I'm nostalgic for Marvel before. I'm nostalgic for going to see Iron Man and being, like, hyped about it, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
I want to go back to that time. No, I think...
Speaking of, like, little blocky character models, though, I like the little, they were so far away that, like, you didn't need all the detail on those models, you know?
Who cares? I'm nostalgic for the announcer going, brutal rampage, fatal rampage? Neither of those are
Brutal rampage sounds more correct to me.
neither of those are right. Savage rampage! That's what it was. That kind of thing. I'm nostalgic for announcers. No, I'm over here looking for the retro local co-op boom. That's the retro aesthetic that I want.
Yeah.
And, frankly, where are my Katamari likes? Where are my Katamari likes?
What is a Katamari like, even? It's so specific that it's hard to be like, yes, I'm going to make a game like Katamari. Like, what is that? How does that look like anything that isn't just like, man, you just stole Katamari?
Here's the thing, though. That's fine.
I don't think it's fine in the realm of law, but yeah, sure.
I guess I haven't played Donut County, right? Donut County is like the Katamari-like, right?
Yeah, yeah.
More of that. More of little weird dudes pushing a ball around like a city. Like, I'm talking about more of like little weird people like hitting a watermelon on the beach. More of games where you, like, people go, wah, wah, when you roll them up. More of that.
Very specific there.
No, I really think it's like, there are certain things about games that I look back on, but it's not really anything to do with how they looked. Yeah, I agree. Like X-Men Legends and Marvel Ultimate Alliance and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game that we played a lot of, too.
Oh, yeah.
Same idea, right? Like 4-player beat 'em up situation.
Yeah.
I think that's part of why we really enjoyed River City Girls here, is it's got that, it feels like an arcade game. It's got that arcade game kind of like control feel. But to me, it really just reminded me of like playing those games.
Well, that is, River City Girls is that pixel art?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was also part of what inspired this, is we really enjoyed that, and you know, it's definitely it's inspired by beat 'em up games that, I don't know, I don't really feel like I played the games that it's actually inspired by, but it reminded me of other games.
Unless you played any of the River City ones, then...
Well, I know, but like that whole broad genre of like Streets of Rage type of thing, it's like, I didn't play any of that, but it reminded me of these other, not dissimilar games, and I appreciated that nostalgia. But I think that nostalgia came much more from the fact that it was local co-op than necessarily from too much about the actual experience or look of the game.
Burnout was on PS2, right?
We had a couple of Burnouts, and so I think one of them may have been PS2 and one was PS3. In fact, I'm almost 100% sure of that, because when we just had the PS3 here, we got Burnout, but we couldn't get the Burnout that I really loved. I would really like Burnout Takedown.
Yeah.
But again, nothing about that necessarily, like, I'm not like, I want my Crash racing game to look like it looked.
Yeah.
Like, I don't really care about that. Sometimes, I don't know, I don't, like, love the new upgraded aesthetics of the Crash Team Racing remake they made a couple of years ago, right? Like, there's nothing about that I would say, oh, yeah, I wish it had always looked like this, right? But I also am not over here expecting that it's going to look like the PlayStation 1 one, so... Sometimes I just think that maybe I don't have vision, you know?
I do wonder that sometimes too. We did a graphics like episode where we basically just expressed our bafflement for all these different terms. But I do sometimes feel like I'm like, I don't understand how people could just like look at something and be like, oh, this is 60 frames a second. If you put them right next to each other, I can see it, but I can't look at it and identify it. Or people, like, with remasters that have, like, scaled up artwork, people will be like, this is so ugly, and I'm, like, looking at it, it's like, well, it looks fine. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess? I don't know what I'm looking for here.
Well, on that note.
Not AI art specifically, just like the upscaled stuff that they do sometimes.
Yes, I
can tell when they have 6 fingers.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Oh, one last thing we didn't talk about here that falls into a retro style without actually being retro to games style is, of course, there's also been a surge in sort of like games that look drawn. Right, so like Cuphead, right, as nostalgic to 30s cartoons, and any given game that has the kind of like hand drawn on paper aesthetic as being nostalgic to, I don't know, paper. Right, so
when we use paper, that is nostalgic, right?
I use paper every day. I love paper, but like that is all like a whole other category of kind of retro that I think sometimes gets lumped in with pixel art a little bit, and I feel like Cuphead gets lumped in. It's not pixel art at all, but it gets lumped into that discussion in a way that is like, actually, this is very separate.
Yes. Yeah. I think those are interesting too because they're really like, I feel like they can only do Cuphead because of modern innovations.
Yeah. Imagine Walt Disney trying to do all the art he'd have to do for a video game.
Yeah.
Impossible. Maybe Robo Walt could do it, but not the real one. No, it's true, and it's interesting, right? Those sorts of things, and the same thing with anything that appears hand-drawn, right? Like, oh, I feel like there was one game... Is it Mundawn that is truly, literally hand-drawn?
Yeah, yeah.
But, like, that's a game that's only, like, 4 hours long, right? So...
Yes. And that they still go, like, they're hand-drawn, but they still go into the computer, you know?
Yeah.
And it puts it together.
Retro to the days of flip books.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
Flip books taken to their logical conclusion. So, overall, I still don't think that the PlayStation 2 will ever be a retro thing. That's where I want to close here. That's my spicy take here. I don't think the PlayStation 2 is ever going to get a retro vibe.
I don't know.
I think we'll skip straight to brown tinted games.
I'm ready for the return of the brown.
Well, listeners, do you find that you have a particular retro aesthetic that scratches that nostalgic itch to you? Or are you just someone who's out there that's like, you know, I'm developing nostalgia because I love a platformer and all the platformers are pixel? Do you wish that more games had hardware limitations that were forcing people to discover ways to work around them? Or are you fascinated by the ways in which games are reverse engineering those hardware limitations? CRT modes in games, I think, are so funny. Like,
I've seen a lot of things that's like, basically none of them are very good.
Even just
people
the
seem
concept,
to like Signalysis, but like, a lot of the times they're just like, not actually looking like CRT.
It's all an illusion. So, listeners, if you have a favorite retro game or a game you wish was retro or just thoughts about anything we talked about this episode, hit us up on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat, and read our blog, featuring long-running series Split Screen and Clickbait Boyfriend. But most importantly, if you enjoy the show, never miss an episode and subscribe. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, basically wherever you can find podcasts, wherever you found the podcast today. Subscribe to Talk This so you never miss an episode on Sundays.
Yeah.
Next week, we are talking about an old game and a new game.
The old game is Front Mission. I honestly... Was the new game Signalis?
I don't think so. Because I remember it being like, I don't know what either of these two games are when you pulled them. And I have heard...
was it Soul Hackers 2?
We'll have to go back and listen.
I'm feeling more confident about Soul Hackers 2, but yeah.
That seems more plausible to me. Okay.
We will check.
Or we won't. Or Emma and I will just come in ready to talk about two entirely different games.
I put the next week preview at the bottom of the blog, so I will check.
But in 2 weeks, it's Emma's side quest. Oh, what will it be?
That's the... I don't know. That's the week before PAX, I was just checking.
Yeah, plus coming soon at some point. Probably the PAX episode won't come out on that Sunday. That'll probably be the next week, right?
No, the week after, yeah.
Yeah, so coming soon, Talk This Podcast Takes PAX. If you spot us in video game t-shirts walking around, consider waving. So that's it for this week's show. Thanks for listening. I really should get Cliff Boyfriend to do like a chiptune outro for this specific episode. He's probably got time for that, right? We're doing this live.
Yeah.
He can do this right here, right now.
I don't think so.
Emma, do you have a sign off?
This week, I hope that you are charmingly blocky.